A lot of important issues outlined. We are ready to move on to the next panel, which is dedicated to behavior online and how to prevent and counter gender-based cyber violence, online hate speech, and anti-gender misogynistic online movements.
But before we give the floor over to the next presenters and panelists, we want to involve you in your homes into this conference again. So we have set up a little task in Works up again. If you go to the schedule of the day and next to this panel, you'll also find a task button. And this time we are actually trying to conduct a little poll that you see live behind us. And the poll basically asks you, who in your opinion should take the most responsibility for ensuring cyber safety as regards gender-based violence, hate speech, and anti-gender misogynistic movements. And here are the options. We'll give you a bit of time to see if there is a clear favorite of who should take the leading role. But before we see all the answers, Marlene, what do you think? Who should take the charge?
That's a good question. Well, I believe everyone is responsible for their own actions, but I also believe that social media platforms should be responsible for what's going on these platforms, maybe more than they are today. I think it's difficult, but I see a lot of responsibility there.
Exactly. I think it's kind of unfair for social media platforms to basically ignore what's going on in their environments, right? So, but wow, that was a quick one from 10 to 21. And if we look at the results here, it seems that it is a bit split. It's not a clear. Well, I mean, social media platforms, I think we might have primed people into thinking that they're the most important.
Or maybe they just agree with what I said.
Yeah, maybe you just hit the nail,
yeah,
right?
I've been practicing yesterday.
Yeah.
I knew the question.
Exactly. So it seems that social media platforms are an important actor, according to our viewers, so are governments. And it seems that actually, for example, internet service providers seem to be one of the smaller groups or like one of the smaller players in this area because, I guess their options are somewhat limited as well, but they do provide a link via which hate speech can be shared. So, wow, already 56 answers. I think it's very good. These active participation in these polls is really nice, and I guess this is something that we can later on also share as a sort of an output in addition to all the presentations and videos we have today. But I think, you can still provide a few answers, but I wouldn't want to keep you away from presentations for longer, so...
Yeah, so it is my pleasure to give the floor over to Marina Kaljurand, former Minister for Foreign Affairs and current member of the European Parliament for Estonia, to lead the next panel reflecting on the topic of preventing and countering online gender-based hate speech.
Everybody, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the next panel. And after these enlightening addresses and this poll, which was on the screen, I have to admit that the question of cyber violence has changed a lot since 2016, when I first got involved with the topic, when I was asked by the World Bank to write a report on the situation with cyber violence against women. I have to say that it's much more higher today on political agenda. I have to admit that the role of social media platforms has changed, and what is more important, governments have understood their responsibility and in awareness raising among citizens, among people, but also among professionals. So I'm really thrilled and honored to moderate today's panel. I don't see the panelists yet. I haven't met them before, but I Googled them. And all of them are really extraordinary experts in their field. They will be introduced in due course. But how we will structure today's discussion? We will have 75 minutes. We will start with a presentation by Christian Mogesen, who will also be introduced. Christian will have 15 minutes. He's with us here in Tallinn, which is great. After that, we go to the panelists. We have 6 of them. And as a housekeeping order, I'd like to ask everybody to be sharp, short, and go to the point. Then we will have time also to engage with the audience. So, having said that, happy to give floor to Christian, whom I had the privilege and honor of listening to in Brussels. I loved, I enjoyed, I learned a lot. So please, Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here in Tallinn. So what I'll be talking about today is taking a turn from some of the prior talks that talked a lot about how we help men. I am going to be talking about the men who haven't been helped. So I'm going to be talking about what we usually denote the angry men online. My background for doing so is working with young people, working with online communities, and working with aggressive and destructive groups online. I am today representing the Center for Digital Youth Care out of Denmark. And what me and my colleagues have been doing for the past couple of years have been making and analyzing, building magazines such as last year's Angry Young Men, where we talked about digital radicalization. And we were talking about explaining the manosphere and the angry internet. And we were building a pedagogical and psychological profile of the young men at risk to engage in such online environments. What we're doing this year is building the follow-up, the Even Angrier Young Men, where we will take on a Nordic scope, build a analysis, data-driven, about just how many men are angry on the internet in the Nordics. And we'll be offering some solutions or semblance of solutions to the problem that they may or may not be posing. Our hypothesis for this work is that we see men, young men, gathering in online communities to discuss sadness, ostracization, and feelings of loneliness, all the very vulnerable feelings that men also have. We know that some of these men analyze their plights as sadness or lives not being as good as they're supposed to be. So naturally, some of these men will fragment into smaller groups depending on which parts of the happy life they feel they don't live up to. Maybe it's sexual awareness, maybe it's sexual attention or reputation, maybe it's respect in an academic situation, maybe it's just society's attention that they lack. Whatever it is they're lacking, they'll find other people who will echo that notion. And we know that some of these men will in turn promote violent, manipulative, revolutionary, or in other ways anti-democratic solutions to their problems. What we've found out over the past handful of years when researching this topic is that there is indeed a disproportionately large amount of young men gathering online to discuss feelings of vulnerability. Disproportionate in the fact that they say that they can't do so in any offline space. They can't do it in school, they can't do it in the soccer club, but they can do it in the anonymity of the internet. They always say, I am missing this from being happy. If only I had more sex, if only I had more friends, if only I had more soccer trophies on my mantle back home, then I'd be happy. If I just had this thing, then I'd be happy. We also know that a lot of these young men will dislike being happy because they're told that that is not a manly way to feel. So instead of being unhappy, they turn to anger. So this anger needs a direction, and often we see that this direction is pointed at other minorities. Usually it's women, it's immigrants, it's people of different belief systems, or it's black and indigenous people of color. It's always somebody else. To make a strong others creates a strong us, and these men often need that. What we see is that these young men are broadly, and I mean very broadly, divided into 2 big groups. One of them is political in nature. That's called the alt-right. The alt-right is made up typically of men that have very strong opinions about anybody but themselves. It's immigrants, it's different belief systems, it's women, it's progressive family structures. It's usually based in American politics of the past 10, 15 years, but it's also a counterculture. It's a political ideology that offers not solutions, but just problems with what exists. We should not progress. We should not do this. We don't like this idea. So in this oppositional value, we see not one spokesperson. There's not a head of the alt-right angry internet party, but there's influencers, there's spokespeople, there's role models. And more than that, we see more and more people starting to talk about racial realism. The people who will say, I'm not racist, but we see more and more people starting to talk about the great replacement, the idea that we, the chosen white people, will apparently be overrun in just an hour or a week by others. The others will come and inherit our countries, our nationalities. And we see the alt-right as a very strong, extremely conservative when it comes to family and identity policies movement. But most importantly, it's digital. So even though there might be real-world politicians mimicked or idolized in this community, it's always the digital community standing behind them that's of interest. And this might just be a political ideology. This might just be people voting more right than you and me at the next election. But it's also opinions mimicked by mass murderers, terrorists from all around the world. It's a set of inherited values that are shared on the internet. That's not shared on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat. It's shared further out in more obtuse places on the internet. The other side is not a political ideology. That's a sexual and identity policy-based ideology. It's called the incel ideology, the involuntary celibate. It's a group of men that gather online to discuss why they are involuntary celibate, why they are not given or why they cannot get sex. They don't have a spokesperson, but they do have role models, just like the alt-right. They have a very fixed idea that the more involuntary celibate, the further removed from the potential of having sex you are, the more true to this ideology you must be. They believe that sexual prowess or sexual potential is built into people. It's in your cranial structure, it's in your skin color, it's in how you were born, not who you are. And they believe that there is a very typical us and them. Them being the sexually greedy men, us being the everlasting virgins. And women are also built into two groups. One has acknowledged, the Stacys, that sex is what women can offer, therefore they offer it, they put it on sale, and they definitely put it on display. The other is the Beckys. They're all right, but they're still evil because they're women, but they haven't found out that sex is a commodity they can use to gain traction or power in society and in policy today. One necessity here is that this group of men feel that sex is a right. Therefore, when they're denied sex, they feel oppressed by women and by the greedy men who take all of the available sex. Both of these movements talk about pills. Once you take the red pill from the movie Matrix, you have seen the light, and then you're obligated to fight against the oppression that tries to hold you down, tries to keep you away from political prowess or sexual potential. And this might just be people who do not have sex, but it's also an ideology mimicked by mass murderers and terrorists and people uploading manifests and videos to even further out places on the internet than the alt-right manifestos. So this is not a set of inherited values, but rather a set of inherited ideas about how the world and how people are built. And they connect. Because we have creeds such as this one. Feminist culture will eventually end up being squashed because the men have either become too demoralized or too weakened to protect their women, or because they have become so fed up with the incessant ridicule that they just don't care anymore. So feminism, progression, inclusiveness, is what's eroding societies. This was written by Anders Behring Breivik shortly before he killed 77 people in Norway almost a decade ago. It's shared every day on the internet. The way we work is by engaging with these young men, and what we can see them say is that they all share the sense of being uncertain. They are not from small communities where it's easy to have an identity. They all say that they got lost in society, and the more you get lost in society, the more important it becomes to have someone who is just like you. And if you don't find that in that society, well, there's always the internet. And the more that there's a narrative of someone else after you, the more that there's a narrative of society as unfair and trying to trot you down, the more that there's a narrative of a fictional, probably, elite trying to stunt your growth, or the fact you're being told that you cannot do this alone, you're not good enough, you're not resilient enough, you're not enough alone, well, that's really hard to cope with. And we men could just talk about it, but like I said, this is a man's problem, and we don't talk about problems. Instead, we go over to the group. We go over to the other guys in blue shirts because, well, they might protect us. They might be willing to fight for us against this elite or the guys in red shirts or society as a whole. So what could possibly pose a danger to the average white male in the year 2020? Well, we did spend the past 10, 15, 20 years fighting for Me Too rights, Black Lives Matter, feminism. We've been, over the past 20 years, fighting white supremacy and the patriarchy. We usually say that's good, but if you are a vulnerable white man, you feel like it's you personally who's being fought. Therefore, you seek countercultures, groups of other men fighting this. And this might be the MRA or the incels or the men going their own way or the alt-right. But the manosphere is not the only thing we were talking about. Last year, we had a survey in Denmark where we asked thousands of people, has the fight for equality gone too far? And 43% of them said, yes, the fight for equality has gone too far. And that's in Denmark. We usually pride ourselves on being at the forefront of any egalitarian or liberal policy. So this movement, these ideologies, also appropriated from Hollywood films with faceless protagonists who fight the oppressor, who will do everything in their power to halt the fight from above. And instead of an evil society here, well, it's feminists, it's women, and it's the academics, it's the elite, it's the left-leaning journalists that need to be fought. And of course that's mimicked depending on where you go online. It's so easy, once you start down this rabbit hole, to find influencers, to find popular, to find digital rock stars saying that women want to be raped. The only goal for any women online is to fight any man. No matter how much of an alpha male you are, there will be a bitch that will at some point take away anything you built in life. You need to fight the feminists. You need to crush feminism. This is a call to arms that's mimicked everywhere online today. And we built online these pseudo rock stars as the people, the Superman, the Batman, the Rorschach, the V that will fight for us because no one else is doing so. And in building these things up, we also see that young men will, to an increasing level, seek the anonymity of digitality because they're vulnerable and they do not feel the possibility of being vulnerable in any offline space because vulnerability is not a masculine feeling yet. So why don't they just go to Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat like the rest of us and receive a bunch of likes for happy pictures of food or vacations or pictures with our girlfriends and so on? Because they don't. We see them congregating at different image boards or secluded media or on the dark web. And we need to ask ourselves the question, why do these men, having the ability to go everywhere online, choose the abusive digital relationship instead of the happy Instagram world? Because happiness is really hard to live up to. If you're on Instagram, there's an expectation that you're happy, you're good looking, you have friends, you have happy pictures that I can go in and like. If you don't, well, the feeling of not having that, of being a loser, of being vulnerable, is multiplied tenfold. So instead of trying to win at the Instagram life, instead of trying to live up to this bar, we see these men instead trying to tear down the bar. And like one of the young men that we interviewed in this project told us, the child who's not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth, or he'll build his own village. And we see more and more of these movements starting to promote men going back into nature, women going back into the kitchen, and immigrants going back to wherever they came from in order to build a nice new society where they can be happy. They are, in fact, a movement of, they call themselves real men, need for real women with real policies. And this hyper-conservatism or anti-progression is understandable because it was, in fact, way easier being a white average man 150 years ago. It's still a pretty sweet deal, but it was easier. So there's this narrative of the man's man, and there's a very nice, like almost like a 10-step plan to become a real man, to become the good man. You need to be one with nature. You need a job that makes you money. You need to eat meat, not soy products, no vegan diets. You need one woman. You need to be able to protect her. You need to drink your coffee black. Like there's this set of rules how to be a good man, how to be a happy man that deserves happiness from society. And the attraction of that, if you're vulnerable, if you're lonely, if you don't have the group of blue shirts in your immediate physical vicinity, this is incredibly attractive. So what we do see is that when we talk to these young men, they are in the midst of the inevitable fluctuation between being happy and sad. Most of us are either happy or sad. Most men will say, I'm fine. But when we're not happy, when we're not as happy as can be, we usually go to our support systems, our hobbies, our friends, our colleagues, our loved ones, because there we might get a little bit of happiness. if we don't believe in those systems, or if the systems don't give us that, we become unhappy. And if we at some point give up believing in those systems, we despair. If we don't feel like being despaired, well, we might choose to get angry and just choose some agency in this problematic world. And anger, despair, unhappiness are incredibly hard feelings to stomach because they're focused on me and they're focused on my feeling of not good enough. Instead, we see these men choosing to form countercultures, direct that anger at something else, direct that anger at not what they're missing, but who's keeping it from them. This means that we effectively create a radicalized digital environment where we meet to discuss about the others that are keeping us from the happiness we deserve. And all of these countercultures will have an object, like who and what's keeping us from this happiness. This might be women, and this explains all our past emotions. This explains to me why I've always been unhappy. I've always tried to be liked by humanity. I've always tried to be loved by women. I've always tried to get this. This goodbye letter was sent hours before a suicide. It was also sent hours before a terror attack that killed several people in the US. It's a goodbye letter. It's a suicide letter by someone who said, I just try to fit in. I just try to be loved and liked. This is not a murder letter or a suicide letter by someone who's angry. This is a letter by someone who is incredibly sad and incredibly vulnerable. And it's mimicked by other mass murderers and terrorists. And the notion of being here, 26, with no friends, no job, no girlfriend. Is this all a series of isolated incidents? We know where these men congregate online. And it would be easy to just suggest deplatforming them, just removing their access to the internet. But as the proprietor of one of these web pages told us, this community is filled with people at their lowest. They suffer, they're alone, and while they can talk about their plight in other spaces, most people simply don't get their issue. They'll be suggested to keep trying to man up, to be more confident, and many of these are unreasonable and unrealistic and make little of the suffering that person is going through. Thus, many of these people were left homeless when they were last deplatformed. And the forum he runs, the biggest incel forum in the world, attempts to recreate such a home for some of them. Does this sound angry? Does this sound like a clubhouse where we meet to plan the next terrorist attack? So the challenges I pose for the panel and for us all to solve, hopefully as soon as possible, is that many digital enemies of feminism and progressiveness believe themselves to be, both on the political and philosophical level, egalitarian. They try to promote equality, and they honestly don't believe that feminism, or what we usually call progressive policies, are egalitarian. We also see them fearing this progression because they feel like it's taking something away from them. And these countercultures are rooted in online environments, and thus they're easy to miss. We don't see them meeting behind the clubhouse every Tuesday afternoon. So we often say, well, they're just meeting online, they're just shitposting it. They're just doing it for giggles. Are we right? Are they right? One problem is that we only acknowledge anger as a truly masculine emotion. We don't know what to do with unhappy or sad or despaired men. Those are usually feminine emotions. We are told to man up. When we only treat anger in men, we risk an emotional snowball effect. We risk them having run through several stages of not feeling good enough, not feeling well, before we reach out to them and tell them, well, you're not supposed to be angry. Just man up, stop being angry. Are we treating sadness problem with anger management? Furthermore, what they do in a lot of these environments is beautiful. They meet, they talk about brotherhood, they talk about congregations, they talk about a sense of worth, they talk about personal goals that can be obtained, they talk about agency for solidarity and so on. This is beautiful. This is exactly what we want young people to do. But when we don't engage with them before they get this far out, all of these very beautiful things will be directed at something very ugly and very dangerous and very violent in nature, namely fighting against perceived oppression. So my closing remarks will be that I see that if we reduce these movements to just being angry or just being violent, we're fixating on a symptom rather than the root cause of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Please, you can join me now in the panel. Thank you for really excellent and thought-provoking remarks, and also posing the questions. So now we move to our panelists. we have panelists from all over the world, and I think that is one of the privileges of having video conferences. We can connect people from Australia to Albania, from Germany to Ireland, Finland, Estonia, and Denmark. We will have 45 minutes to reflect on what Christian said, on the questions that Christian raised, and keeping in mind the very different backgrounds of the panelists. I'm sure that we will have an interesting conversation, and by the end of the first round, Christian, you're welcome to reflect on what the other panelists said. And I'd also like to ask the audience to be active on the worksup.com. Your questions will be also raised to the panelists, so please participate in our discussion. And having said that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Michael Flood from Australia, Queensland. We have Christoph May from Germany. We have Iris Luarasi from Albania. We have Tuija Saresmaa from Finland. Sean Cook from Ireland. And last but not least, Sam de Boise from Sweden. And I apologize if I pronounced some of the names in a weird Estonian way. And I also think that we can agree to go by first name during our panel. So let's forget about professors, ambassadors, ministers. Let's go by first names. So Michael, please. And having said that, finally, I see you all on the screen. Thank you for joining the panel. It's a pleasure to see you. As you noticed, I did not go into your CVs because they are available for the participants of the conference. But please, now we can start with our discussion, and let's go in the same order as I presented you. So, Michael, please, you have the floor. You have the screen.
Thank you. Look, I was really pleased to hear Christian's account of the research he's doing, because this is so urgent, so necessary to really, do research among these men themselves, the young men in these online spaces, and to understand what brings them to these spaces and the kinds of preoccupations they have and so on. So I was really pleased to hear that. And, obviously the practical question is then, what do we do? And I've been thinking about, three streams of intervention I think we can, consider, at least for what you've called the angry young men, or the very angry young men, and I like that description. One is to address the social and economic and emotional conditions that bring those young men to those spaces. So if it's a need for, support or a way to resolve kind of profound unhappiness and so on, one obvious strategy is to change the pathways that bring those men to those spaces, given that I'd argue those spaces are dangerous spaces for them. A second strategy is an empowerment or education strategy, where we work directly with those young men or with other young men at risk of joining those spaces to foster, if you like, healthier and more equitable understandings and possible pathways. And a third strategy is rehabilitation, to work to kind of de-radicalize those men. And I think that there is some insight to be gained from the work on countering violent extremism. And I've been engaged in a major project here in Australia trying to draw from the countering violent extremism literature to sort of think about what might that tell us about how to work in effective ways with angry young men. Just to keep it short, I wanted to make two further comments. One is, and I was pleased to hear this said about Denmark as well. Anti-feminist beliefs, the belief that feminism's gone too far, men are now the victims, feminism is taking over. These are common beliefs. They're not confined to the manosphere or confined to small online communities. They're in fact widespread. You said in Denmark, certainly the same is true in Australia. And so to understand what shapes these young men's pathways to these spaces, one thing we have to pay attention to is general discourses of anti-feminism in our culture. The other point I wanted to make is I do think these spaces themselves are unhealthy for those young men. It seems to me that the powerful emotional needs that young men bring to those spaces are not well addressed in those spaces. Instead, I think what's more likely is those men are fixed in anger, fixed in blame, and they end off worse emotionally. So I don't want us to be naive about the forms of brotherhood or solidarity that are available in those spaces, because I think in some ways they can be deeply dangerous or harmful. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And from here, let's go to Christoph. Christoph, I visited yesterday your Detox Masculinity Network, and I was really impressed by the videos and blogs you had there. You should have more in English, because majority was in German. But still, if you could share your views on the topic, please.
Hello from Germany. It's really nice to meet you all. And I deeply share the experience from Christian, but I am not working with young boys and teenage men. I do a lot of online community building and real life workshops with grown-ups. I run 3 Facebook groups, for example, that I manage together with 9 moderators. One is on critical masculinity. It's about masculinities in our social, daily, real life, our jobs, our families, our friendships, and so on. The second one is on male fantasies. Here we talk about male representations of men and masculinities in TV series and movies. And a third one is on male monocultures. So where we do research on male-dominated groups to discuss their structural power and how to break them up. And we have 4,000 members in total there, and the daily topics and talks and posts are really interesting. So it is a high level of discussion and awareness, but it needed a couple of years and a lot of work until we got to this point. So after 2 years and hundreds of threads, we realized that we need some rules and strategies to avoid trolls and hate speech and anti-feminists. So we have 4 main rules I would like to share with you. The first one is we only talk about man and masculinity. We needed this rule because we noticed that especially men are really good in whataboutism and try to derail any topic really fast into talks about women. So with this rule, we make sure that any thread is self-critical and about masculinity. Our second rule is about the standard of intersectional feminism and pro-feminism. So against all kinds of discriminations, of course. The third rule is against the tone policing. You are not allowed to attack someone's voice, tone, emotions, and so on. And our fourth rule is about victim blaming and not all men argumentation. So these 4 simple rules work really good to avoid hate speech and misogyny and anti-feminists. I highly recommend to find your own rules to build up safe and supportive community. It is absolutely important to create a critical but peaceful environment where everyone feels welcome and safe. And of course, it is really interesting and often a tough journey. And it is so much an intense emotional work you have to put into this, but it's absolutely worth it. And I'm still learning every day.
Thank you, Christoph. And I'd like to move to Iris. And I'm really happy that we have 2 ladies participating in today's discussion, because usually it's women discussing women things and men discussing men things. So I think that we have at least some gender balance on this panel. And Iris, you have a double hat. You're the first vice president of Grevio, group of experts on action against women and domestic violence in the Council of Europe, but you're also actively participating in counseling in Albania for young men and youngsters. And Iris, you sent us PowerPoint presentation, which we will be happy to share on the website after our conference. So Iris, please.
Thank you, Marina. I have also a third head, I think, because I'm also coming from the communication field as a professor in the university for more than 20 years. So that's why, for me, it's very convenient to talk about having the expertise in the gender equality, but also in the communication. And I just wanted to share with you also an example that comes from media, because The Guardian commissioned the research into the 70 million comments that were left in their site from 2006, and discovered that of the 10 most abused writers, 8 were women, and the 2 men, they were black. So due to the time when Istanbul Convention was designed, there was no specific provision on cybercrime. But there are several articles that we use in the convention in relevant provision to monitor this topic. So that's why, very briefly, I will present only some of them, since you are going to share my presentation. In the report on France, for example, based on the Article 4 of the Convention, we underline the fact that adolescent girls aged 12 to 15 are reported to be 1.5 to 2 times more affected by cyber sexism than boys, and that verbal and sexual cyber violence against girls is an area where sustained advocacy efforts remain necessary. On the Article 34 of the Istanbul Convention, that it is talking about stalking, Grevy also noted that the introduction of an offense relating to group cyberbullying under the law. In the report in Sweden, we welcome the amendment of the offense of molestation, and this offense now covers a wider range of behavior which is experienced as threatening to the victim, including silent phone calls, emails, other online and offline contact. While in the report on Turkey, we urged the Turkish authorities to establish stalking as a separate offense and to subject to an effective and dissuasive punishment, having due regard to its possible monitoring in the digital sphere. In our report in Denmark, and that's the last example that I'm bringing, we welcomed the form of an evidence-based policy approach and commended the Danish authorities on their continuous endeavor to evaluate existing measures in order to address any gaps. Last year, in December, the Committee of Ministers, the Council of Europe, held an informal debate on cyber violence, where I presented some of the data that we have monitored as Grevio. And since then, there has been quite some discussion about the synergies between the Istanbul Convention and the Cybercrime Convention on how to sufficiently address the issue. And in the last meeting, Grevio had a thematic discussion internally to get some clarity as the types of violence that this concept covers and scope for action. So we approved the terms of reference of the working group that will work jointly with Cybercrime Convention at Council of Europe on general recommendation on the digital dimension of violence against women. And I am absolutely extremely happy to be part of the working group. So at the end, I just want to emphasize that cybercrime in general are perpetrated by both sexes. Data from several international studies have revealed that girls are more likely than boys to suffer sexual cybercrimes, both in social and intimate relationships, showing that the cultural norms underlying gender violence are also reproduced in the virtual world.
Thank you, Iris, for your remarks. And let's go to Tuija from the University of Jyväskylä. And Tuija, you also have double hats. You are teaching at the university, but you're also the chair of the Finnish Association of Gender Studies, and your specialty is populism, belonging and displacement, hate speech and social media. So it would be great to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'd love to be in Tallinn, but it's nice this way as well. So I really am a researcher of contemporary cultural studies, and I'm currently studying populism and hate speech on and through social media mainly. But I started as an autobiography researcher, and alongside digitalization, I became interested in the blogosphere quite innocently, actually. But soon enough, I, however, ended up reading blogs by a notorious Finnish anti-feminist who kept ranting about women's sexual power, the so-called women's sexual power, and men's equality, the need for men to have equality, that is. So as a researcher, when I first ran into explicit anti-feminism and misogyny on the internet, I almost could not believe my eyes. Some men were really proud about their misogyny and their self-declared anti-feminism. Soon, of course, I noted that the backlash is real. It's really happening online as well, and that there is a dark side of the internet. And I'm not talking only about the xenophobic, racist, far-right nationalist, anti-immigration minded, even white supremacist online communities, but also these very explicitly anti-feminist affective communities based on hatred and pure misogyny. So I suggest that there are two keys to analyzing this phenomenon of anti-feminism and misogyny and the manosphere. And this is what I, as a researcher, do. I analyze, and maybe I leave the more practical proposals for action to others. So the two keys are, first, the concept of affective community, because it emphasizes the social aspects of emotions or feelings or affects, which, to my understanding, are crucial in these kinds of phenomena. And second, intersectionality as a perspective and even a method for analyzing various technologies of power and subordination. And, for example, emphasizing the privileges of white heterosexual men. But perhaps we can come back to these later. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuija. And from here we'll go to Sean. I'd like to congratulate you for, as much as I understood, now you're open 7 days a week for counseling because of the COVID-19 situation, which is difficult for many groups. And you've been for almost 30 years engaged with the topic of counseling and health programs, CEO of the Men's Development Network. So, Sean, how does it look on the ground?
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's great to be among such an illustrious group of people and with such expertise. So I suppose the first thing I really would like to say is that having listened to Christian and his presentation, I was hugely saddened by listening to what is actually happening for young men in these particular areas. It made me feel there was a sense of loss around it, and certainly my concern would be is losing these young men and these potentially talented young men to a rhetoric and a movement in which undermines their opportunities to be their most authentic selves. I was really kind of caught by that today when I heard Christian's presentation. And the other bit that struck me was that there has always been a perception that boys, young men, and men themselves are slow in which to present their emotions. And yet, here we have is very clearly in this kind of online environment, they find an opportunity in which to express these things like sadness and vulnerability, which I thought that in some ways that's a positive thing that is actually happening. So then the challenge is, of course, is about being able to respond to that vulnerability and sadness in a way that is actually productive, positive response to it, as opposed to somebody coming in and using that vulnerability to direct them in another way. So that was they were my initial feelings at the start of the conversation today. And I just wanted to kind of maybe say them. The other bit, I suppose, is what in terms of strategies, and very much I agree with the kind of the three-strand approach which Michael talked about in terms of, certainly in terms of addressing radicalization and education, and then looking at the whole issue around those social determinants that bring about these particular situations for young men. And our experience, I suppose, we've had as an organisation, we're a frontline organisation. We're a men's development organisation that's underpinned by a very strong feminist approach and perspective. And And with that, our work is around, it's a developmental approach with men, young men and boys. And so a lot of our work is in a face-to-face experience. And so some ways our challenge now is actually moving into that virtual world, certainly in terms of COVID-19, moving into that virtual world where we can deliver our work and offer our services to boys and men. And that's a challenge, as we all know, going forward as well. But I suppose the other bit that's really there is about that anti-feminist rhetoric that is out there, and I think that's a serious challenge that we have as a movement to address. And I think, interestingly enough, reasonable people or people working with a strong feminist approach would not get into an adversarial process online with these kind of, like, it's very difficult to argue these kind of questions online. It becomes quite bombastic and difficult to deal with. So people kind of steer away from it, which I think is probably the best thing to do. But I suppose for me, the critical things there's no difference in terms of how we respond to these things, whether it's online or stuff that we see on a day-to-day basis in terms of our lives, in terms of challenging behaviours. There are societal shifts that need to happen around addressing the issue of equality. The feminist approach in relation to it is a critical one that offers that opportunity around love, respect, and dignity. And these are things that need to be carried forward. And this is what we try to do on the day-to-day ground. And what we're trying to do now is to kind of bring it into another a digital realm as well, to give ourselves an opportunity to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And finally to Sam, who approaches gender equality through music. Sam is the lecturer in musicology at the School of Music, Theatre and Art of Örebro. So Sam, please, your take.
Hi. So first of all, thank you very much both to Christian and to the fellow panelists. I'm really honoured to actually be participating in this. So as was explained, so my research is focused primarily on music, but my background's in sociology. So I'm interested, like, what do people do with music and what function does it play? And how I got interested in this topic was primarily because a lot of research focuses on what music is misogynistic. So I wanted to turn that question around and say, well, what do people who express explicitly misogynistic views listen to? So I kind of got involved in the manosphere and looking at these forums through that way. And I guess having been working in kind of critical studies on men and masculinities, I think one thing that's important to emphasize here is that this kind of tendency, this anti-feminist tendency, and this amalgamation of anti-feminism and white nationalism is not necessarily new. I'm thinking back to, there were men's societies formed at the start of the century when giving women the vote was the issue, for example. So this kind of backlash has always existed. And if you look back to the 1990s, you have the kind of mythopoetic men's movements that express many of the same discourses, this idea of the kind of ahistorical, eternal masculine as something that exists outside of society. So I think looking at the rise and fall of these movements is also a kind of path to working out how to kind of combat this rhetoric. I think one thing that struck me from Christian's presentation as well is he said, for example, we only recognize anger as a masculine emotion. And I think there is often a tendency to kind of downplay the rational aspects of these forums. And I don't mean rational in the sense that I agree with them. I mean rational in the sense that there is a whole belief system. So we can't just characterize these as kind of irrational. Because one of the things that these sites do, and Christian pointed to this, is they have their own ideologues. They have their own ideology that is supported by kind of key thinkers. So you think of Jordan Peterson, for example. And Jordan Peterson is one of the people that pushes this idea to be masculine is essentially to repress your emotions. So there is a kind of ideology that affirms this very static idea of what masculinity is that's being kind of shared. And the other thing is, I mean, it borrows a lot of terminology from kind of left-wing social movements as well. And Christian talks about this idea of the red pill. So this kind of consciousness raising. And in my own research, when people talk about this kind of moment of engagement, then it has a profound impact on their life. And so these kind of terminologies being borrowed from progressive social movements, from feminist social movements, from Marxist social movements, as a kind of masculinist consciousness raising. So it's kind of not just irrational, I think. And I guess on this point, that there is a kind of deliberate manipulation of these spaces as well. To a certain extent, yes, they are very organic, but one of the things that my research was looking at was actually that traffic to these sites kind of increased in the run-up to the US election. Traffic to these sites increased in the run-up to the Brexit election because these sites were getting more and more coverage from the media. So actually, the kind of media is complicit in driving traffic to these sites by making them so explicit and so kind of illicit. And I think I'll just say something finally, and I guess it's a question to everyone. On the question of how to tackle this, I think there's a lot of work that's being done actually by YouTube influencers, and I'm thinking of primarily kind of left tube influencers like ContraPoints, for example, H-Bomber Guy, people that were active in kind of 4chan forums, people that were active in gaming forums that are taking a stand against this. And I kind of wonder how much we should use the kind of aesthetics, the kind of arguments that are being promoted in these as a means of kind of lifting those voices of people that have been involved in these communities, but have actually gone more over to kind of feminist and progressive politics. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sam. Christian, you listened to all the panelists. Did you get answers? What's your reflection?
Yeah. There are some amazing insights and some really amazing perspectives from different takes on gender equality and gender studies and sociology in general. I don't think we quite fixed egalitarian policies yet, but to comment on what Sam said, I think there is a low-hanging fruit hidden in pointing to some of the YouTubers or some of the influencers that shifted from the, let's call it the right wing or the dark web into the left-leaning or progressive internet, like ContraPoints. One of the amazing things that you can do from that perspective is to say, well, I've been there. I've seen this. I've engaged in these topics. I lend creed to the arguments and the internal proof that holds up, and then say, I agree with it, and engage with it in an honest and caring way. What I often hear from these young men or adult men who share these beliefs is that, well, it's easy for you to say, and they'll point at me, or they'll point at someone like our panel, where it's a bunch of four of you guys are successful men who look good. And they look at you and they say, well, how would you know how I feel? Because I don't look good, I don't feel good, and I'm not in a good place in my life. Having people coming from internally in those communities and then not taking a stand against them, but trying to explain how they evolved out of them, I think that's immensely powerful. I see some of the most, it's called upvoted, most popular threads on a lot of these forums are people who return to them after a 2-year hiatus saying, guys, I managed, now I'm happy. And everybody wants to hear, how did you get happy? And they'll find some excuse as to why they can't get happy. Oh, you got a girlfriend? Well, I can't get a girlfriend. Oh, you got a job? My country is in recession. Like, I can't get happy. But the story itself, the narrative that you can actually get happy, that's immensely powerful. And I think that's a key into engaging with these young men, doing so honestly.
Thank you, Christian. We had the first round of introductory remarks. And as you can see, we're running out of time. It's not fair, but to try to be more constructive and to try to be structured, maybe the question I'd like to pose to you is: in the present situation, you are talking from the side of academia, international organizations, people who are counseling, people who are looking at the topics from different perspectives. So, if you have to name a couple of steps, a couple of things that have to be done in the near future, what are they? Because at the beginning, when I said I compared to 2016, I would argue that a lot has changed. Some things have changed to better, some things have changed to worse. Yes, the topic is more high on political agenda. Yes, international organizations and governments are dealing with cyber violence more than they did 5 years ago. But we have deepfake, we have much more complicated cyber violence forms arriving. So what are the things that have to be done if you have to advise today? So let's start the same way from Michael.
That's a good, tough question. Thank you. Look, I think that we have to address both the affective, the emotional or social dynamics of these spaces and the needs they address, and the ideological, the more explicitly political aspects of these spaces. So I think one stream of activity is to find alternative sources of support, of connection, of community for men, both face-to-face and online. I think a second complementary stream of activity is a more ideological, politicised critique of the norms that bring some men to those spaces, or that inform their participation in the spaces, or indeed their use of violence outside those spaces. So, for example, incels. In addressing incels, we have to address the notions of male sexual entitlement that structure their communities, and these are notions which are in fact widespread in society. So I think we need work on both the social and emotional and the ideological aspects of these spaces.
Thank you, Michael. Christoph, you mentioned already the 4 steps. I listened very carefully to what you said. So maybe let's move more generally. What do you expect the government to do to tackle the topic of cyber violence in a more comprehensive way?
Well, on the government is made out of people, so and they are persons, so it's always personal. Politics are always personal, and on a personal level, I would recommend to what we can do, what every one of us can do right now is break up your male peer group wherever you can, whether it is your soccer team or your group of all male friends. Second, check your streaming behaviors and switch to series and movies of female writers. Listen to music of female singer-songwriters. Only read books of female writers and so on, and your perspective will change radically. And third, be self-critical, be intersectional and act pro-feminist every day and week and month from now on. Support women and women's rights. Detox your own masculinity and break up male monocultures wherever you go. That's what I can recommend. So,
Christos, thank you for that. It's an excellent recommendation also to Estonian government. I hope that they're listening to our panel today and they take it very seriously. Iris, what's your perspective?
As Grevio, we do a lot of monitoring and a lot of recommendation. But I think that monitoring goes hand by hand also with the possibilities of creating synergies with other monitoring bodies and other conventions if we really want to succeed on that. And cyber violence is a serious challenge for both victims and also for the society. And in order to quantify a crime, I absolutely think that we need to have legislation in place. A lot of online sexual abuse exists on encrypted parts of the internet, and people don't self-report, often because of shame, coercion, or because they don't know that it is wrong. So even from the perspective of media and communication, I would point that the most important tool for eliminating cyber violence is prevention. That goes hand by hand with law enforcement and also with initiatives that are taken by governments, but also from international organizations like Council of Europe, European Commission, communities, and absolutely engaged individuals. So everyone has to make a contribution, and only then it's possible probably to imagine a world which is safer and more secure.
Iris, if I may, you mentioned legislation, you mentioned norms. How do you see it? Should it be states and governments writing these laws, or should it be international conventions and being implemented by states and governments, knowing that write international conventions or write international law is a very complicated task?
Yeah, that's so true, and that's why I told you that as a monitoring body in Grevio, that's why we are working right now very closely with the Cyber Convention at Council of Europe in order to come with a draft on digital dimension on violence against women. But I think that also countries, several ones from the examples that I gave you from the monitoring reports that we have done so far, some countries are putting some law in place, but it should be also, from my perspective, it should be coming also a lot of regulation from international bodies.
Thank you, Iris. And going to Tuija, because you mentioned social platforms and you're following so closely social platforms. We had the poll where the role of social platforms was also mentioned. They should have a bigger role. And I agree. 5 years ago, Facebook was saying that they are just providing space for exchange of information. Today, Facebook has very strong review mechanism and removal mechanism, and they have even boards who control what's being posted. So what's your view on that?
I totally agree that these platforms need to be they have to take their responsibility, and they need the money, so they are willing to do some adjustments there, I'm sure, but we also have other responsibilities, and I think that a great change has happened because, at least in Finland, hate speech has been taken seriously lately, and the government right now is making legislations that are preventing. I don't know what's that in English, but it's called in Finnish maalittaminen, which means that a powerful, influential person suggests in the internet that his followers would go and attack usually a young woman with liberal values, and to attack her in the internet. And this is about to become illegal soon, and that is, I think, a very good thing. But before we can ask the social media enterprises to do something, we have to acknowledge that hate speech is a real problem, and we have to emphasize that online hate is a certain form of violence against women, mostly women, and other marginalized groups. So we have to take this phenomenon seriously, and that is what I think is happening in Finland, at least at the moment, and I think that's very essential here.
And if I might add, and also I think Finland is also known for the case of Jessica Aro, when a real punishment of 22 months of imprisonment was introduced to the perpetrator of defamation. So your country is really taking very concrete steps in that field.
Yes,
Sean,
and I'm proud of that. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, Sean, what's your take? What should be the next steps?
Well, I think for me, I think the next steps are very much around there are steps that we've been taking before, which is around that education element, going back to basics in terms of working with young men and young women, addressing those issues of gender, social conditioning, inequality. And I think they are the critical things that need to be done. And on an individual basis, I think there has been a lot of youth work that happens, and it has moved into the digital arena now, which is really quite good. I've come across a particular an Erasmus European program, which is about digital youth work, so it was about engaging young people in a digital form around the work. So it would be attracting those type of young people who actually access and socialize online. So I think there's work. That work still needs to continue in terms of, providing support to those individuals around building their resilience on a day-to-day basis, wherever it is, so they don't find themselves succumbing themselves to that isolated environment in terms of where they might be online. I think that's really, really important, and I think as well the organisational end of it too. So, and of course, I think at a legislative, and I think it needs it's driven by Europe. I think it's the way to go, because I think if you're looking at, I thought it was really interesting when you did the poll at the start of the session, where you looked at who was responsible around cybercrime and stuff like that, and there was very little percentage around the internet providers, and I think that's a real critical area around forcing internet providers to be aware of what they're actually placing upon their particular platform, and making them responsible for that, especially in the area of pornography and all of the other areas in terms of like that. So that'll be a big area in terms of the legislation. I think, and individually, we need to continue the day-to-day building of resilience and work with young people. And then organisationally, then I think it has to be around addressing that particular concepts of the rhetoric around anti-feminism.
Thank you, Sean. And Sam, I'm sorry, I'm looking into the wrong camera all the time, yeah? So you've seen a lot of my profile. So it's so difficult to look into the camera and not into your faces, but I'll try. So Sam, besides listening to good music produced by women composers and conducted by women conductors, what are your other advices? How to tackle?
I mean, I think obviously the big one is education, and that's kind of educating people about the diversity. This is something Christian pointed to, that there is this very one-sided view of what masculinity is, and that can take like many forms. So I talk about like different expressions of masculinity in music history, for example, but it's about actually broadening people's ideas of what masculinity is and can be in order to get people to actually kind of take opening up about what makes them vulnerable seriously. So I think education is definitely one. But I think absolutely I agree with the other panelists in terms of putting pressure on social media companies to take more responsibility as to what's posted on their platforms. And we're seeing some changes there, but it's still not enough. And the problem is often that if you engage someone in a discussion about music, for example, that quickly turns to anti-feminism, like when do you draw the line? But I think that social media companies are getting better about that. But also, as I said before, I think I hasten to use the term role models, but actually using people, working with people that have been involved in these communities, that have kind of come out the other side and seen some of the errors in what they've previously thought. I think that's really important because it gives a credibility. Because we can talk all we like about how people should respond, but unless we've got some kind of credibility in these communities, these young men are not going to listen to us. So I think actually working with people that have been involved in these communities and that no longer share these politics, I think is important. And I think finally, I mean, as academics, we tend to publish our articles in academic journals and then leave it there. And I think it's also up to us to take on these kind of more public academics who have become the face and the figureheads for the alt-right. And I'm thinking of Jordan Peterson primarily, but also in Sweden, Eva Arpi, for example, and actually engaging with these people in public spaces. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And before we open it to the public, to the audience, Christian, you have the final words on this point.
I love all the comments and I love all the advice from the panel. I'll offer three things. One of them is to stop treating online violence or digital violence as what should we call it, physical violence. Like no one got hurt, so you can't really report it to the police. It's not necessarily a physical crime. It's an anti-democratic movement and it should be treated as such. Secondly, I would love for the discussion that's going on right now that feminism is the antithesis, the opposition to masculinity. Like this, feminism is the opposite of masculinity. We need someone, academics or practitioners, to have that discussion because right now there's this narrative that if you as a man say, well, I am a feminist, people are going to say, well, you don't look particularly homosexual, but okay, fair enough. Like there's this idea that, well, then you're effeminate and then you're weak and then you're vulnerable and you're less of a man. And it's not dangerous. Like I am a feminist. I still have my beard and all that. Like I'm not less of a man because of that. And we need as men between each other to stop agreeing to the answer to the question, how are you? Like fine is not an answer. We need to take hold of ourselves and our friends and say, no, how are you really? Like there's an emotional empowerment that we need of men, young men, adult men alike.
Thank you, Christian. And now I hope we have some questions from the audience. So please, Marlene and Siim.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions. Thank you. It's been very interesting. A lot of people thank Christian for a great presentation here. And question number one. Are angry young men overrepresented in certain socio-economic groups?
So we'll go to Christian, and if anybody wants to interfere, please just raise your hand, and you're most welcome to.
From what we see right now, which is basically a practical research, a qualitative research, is that yes, they are. But not from where we'd expect to find them. Like we have this Hollywood notion of the basement dweller who's really good at World of Warcraft and nothing else, and then he sits in his basement or camper van, hates on women online. What we do see, in fact, is that a lot of these men that are extremely anti-feminist or anti-egalitarian are university or college educated, and they have a demographic basis for feeling an entitlement to a good life. Like, I am doing all these things. I'm getting an education. I'm making some sort of money. All of this. Why am I not the recipient of happiness? That being said, we do see quite a few of the most vocal ones having issues with some sort of mental issues, and probably without money or any social network. Like, there's these two groups. One of them is affectionately called needs, not an employment, education, or training. So we do see some demographic tendencies, but it's not that we can say everybody is in this one cluster. We see these two big clusters.
Anybody else would like to add something to what Christian said? No, let's go to the next question.
To the next question. The next question is actually a comment and then a question. And it goes like this. Info point, very relevant to this discussion. Today, Laura Bates, the founder of Everyday Sexism, published her new book, Men Who Hate Women. From incels to pickup artists, the truth about extreme misogyny and how it affects us all. Question. Could you say more about how, in your perspective, the alt-right and incel cultures are related to everyday sexism?
Can I...
Yeah, let's start with Christian and then the others.
Like, if we start with this everyday sexism or everyday anti-feminism, we usually operate with this term, the Overton window, that the window in which things are okay to say. And if we, on the street, in parliament, in management, have an idea that it's okay to be, well, just a tiny bit sexist, just like comment a tiny bit on her dress, just talk a tiny bit about her ass and those shoes, like, then we're moving the Overton window. And then at some point, we moved the median for what's okay to say extremely far to the side. Because, well, no one ever died of a tiny slap on the ass. Well, at some point you're going to say, well, no one never died of a tiny casual date rape. Like, we're moving the Overton window by this everyday sexism. And by allowing everyday sexism, we're effectively enabling violence against women and minorities. So that's the short answer.
Anybody else would like to add something to this? Yeah. Yes. Michael, please.
I think in terms of the shifts in gender attitudes or gender norms that we see among young men and among young people in many Western countries, what we see is a kind of uneven shift, where on the one hand, there's a widespread support for liberal feminist ideas of women's and men's equality in public and economic life. But when it comes to, say, sexuality and relationships, we see, particularly in Australia, in North America, and some European countries too, instead regressive shifts, shifts backwards, where there's a growing willingness to believe that women often make up accusations of sexual assault, a growing willingness to see women and girls as only sexual objects, and so on. In addressing the kinds of problems we've been talking about, we need targeted efforts to address particular forms of sexist belief or sexist ideology that are very much everyday and getting worse.
Thank you, Michael. Back to Marlene. Sorry, Iris, please. Sorry. So I have to look at you. I can't look at the camera. So I turn my back to them and look at you. Iris, please.
No, I just wanted to mention that in 2014, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, they published a result on a survey that is absolutely giving the same data on violence against women and girls suffered in their families and also on the internet. And according to the survey, women aged 18 to 24 are at a heightened risk of being exposed to every kind of cyber violence. And especially in Europe, 80% of women have experienced a form of cyber violence since the age of 15, which corresponded to about 9 million women.
Yeah, thank you. Marlene, back to you.
And another question and a comment goes like this. I just wondered, what about the angry old men who tend to be most powerful and therefore most dangerous?
Sean, I'm looking at you with your... No. You're not an angry old white man, but because you're not dealing with young men only, you are dealing with men of all ages, different backgrounds. So, what would you say?
Well, I suppose we're in a fortunate situation in our organisation. We work with perpetrators and also with victims of domestic violence, along with doing developmental work with men of all ages. And I suppose the key issues has always been around engaging with men around their particular perceptions and their understanding and the various different sexist ideologies that they may have. And there is no doubt that when you are older, you potentially acquire more power. And if you're coming into that age with sexist views and a particular perspective, you're certainly going to take advantage of it, and your sense of privilege is going to remain intact. So a lot of our work is about trying to challenge that, challenge that understanding, challenge those behaviors, and push and informing people in a way that most likely it's in a non-blame environment. It's about kind of saying, presenting the situation, getting people to reflect. I thought it was interesting what Christian said earlier there about we need to be having these conversations. And when somebody asks you, how are you, to say just fine is not okay. Well, one of our critical pieces of work that we do with men is our 7 key questions. And the first question is how are you? And then the next question is what's been going well for you? And they're very kind of simple questions really at the end of the day, but they allow a period of reflection. They allow you an identification of issues that may be there, and they allow you then to go take action. And that's how I would see it. Like, a lot of this is an educational, a lot of this is around experiential learning and providing those spaces. If somebody is misogynistic, it's not saying that they can change, but they will continue to do it if they aren't necessarily challenged on their behavior.
Sean, if I might follow up, could it be also that old men, they are not on social platforms, they are not in the internet, because the generation, let's say, I don't know, 65 plus, 70 plus, they are not maybe eager to learn the new platforms. So they are drinking, they are doing other things, but we just don't see them in social media and we don't see them in cyberspace.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in the whole idea of usage of social media or social platforms. I'm not we had, interestingly enough, when we started, because of COVID-19, and we had to reconfigure and recalibrate our work with all of our client groups and service users. We thought we would have a difficulty with the older grouping of men in terms of access to internet and the various different tools that are necessary. But I have to say, we haven't found it. What do we mean? Do we mean people in their 70s? But we mean older men. But I'm in my 50s and I'd be fairly reasonably literate in terms of digitally literate. So and people have phones and a smartphone. So I don't think it is. I think maybe there is a generational issue around how people engage with social media. Certainly, I would have a different way of engaging with it than certainly my 2 sons would do, or somebody in their mid-30s, because they've kind of grown with it. So I think there are definitely those trends that are there, but I couldn't really give a definitive answer on it.
Thank you, Christian, and then to Sam.
There's definitely a reasoning behind the angry old men on the internet. Everybody by 2020 is on Facebook, including the old people, meaning that usually the young people will move away from Facebook because it's filled with old people, their parents and grandparents. So actually we see the numbers indicating that the primary violent abusers on Facebook are angry old white men, at least in Denmark, because the young people will be on a different platform. But back to the base question, usually when we talk about gender education or just relevant education, we have this idea that it's about young people. We also need to educate adults. And 2 days ago in Denmark, we had consent-based rape laws, finally. So, this would be where the audience would clap usually. But we had one old angry man politician who said, well, now we have a problem because now we're going to have way more rapes in Denmark. Now we're going to have more convictions, not more rapes. And there is this idea that, well, when I was young, this wasn't a problem. Therefore, how can it be a problem now? There's an idea often in this angry old men demographic that if we address a problem, then we create it. And I disagree. Like Noe just pointed out, so we can finally find a solution, not sweep it under the rug. So,
right. Sam, please.
I mean, it's a great question because one of the things is it talks about the way in which violence operates on different levels. So when we think about violence, we tend to think about it something happening between two people. But of course, there's kind of structural violence, which I think the question is alluding to. So who has kind of economic power to do kind of various forms of violence that aren't necessarily like directly between two people? And one of the things here is obviously there's not all older men who have power. So say, for example, when we tend to think of old men who have power, we tend to think of politicians. We tend to think of people that are the heads of like the largest banks in the world or whatever. But that's not the majority of older men. So I think it's important when we talk about older men to recognize kind of class distinctions here as well. But one of the things here that I think is important is who benefits. There's the question, who benefits from perpetuating this kind of these spaces that actually facilitate this kind of conflict? And I do genuinely think that these spaces have been kind of co-opted by people for their own agendas. And I think about kind of Steve Bannon, for example, as an older man who deliberately kind of used these sites, used these people in order to foster conflict, in order to drive essentially a white nationalist agenda. So I think it's an important question is to ask who actually benefits personally from this and to see violence as both interpersonal and structural as well. So.
Well, I think we have time for the last question.
Yes. Do you think these kind of groups of young, angry men have always been part of a society, or is this a recent phenomenon?
Let's start with Christian again, yeah.
Well, now it would be guesswork. Men have always been angry, sad, like on any end of the emotional spectrum. I think by now with the internet and the advent of these image boards and discussion groups, it's easier to find other angry men. Like, I'm a big proponent of technology and the internet in general because I usually say you're never weird on the internet. No matter who you are, you can always find someone who is just as weird in the same like subculture that you are. That's amazing. That is a literal lifesaver. But it also means that you can find someone who is agreeing with your anger and agreeing like, yes, you should go out and do this or that. So no, I don't think it's a new thing. I think the internet has enabled them to find each other, for good or for worse.
And now also, for the last time, I'd like to look at our panelists. It's the last time for you to speak up. Yeah, Sam, please. And then, yeah, everybody. Let's start with Sam, please. Yes. We don't hear you. Okay, then let's go to Christoph.
I would take the chance to put the last focus on even if we don't see men everywhere, old men especially, they write our stories. They have a huge impact on our stories that we see in film and TV series. So 90% of writers in Hollywood, Netflix, Amazon, and HBO and so on are men, and as long as we don't change the structure they are absolutely overrepresented in our stories, and so they write what we see. They write about lonesome jokers, evil, absent fathers, and we don't need to see that anymore. And Batman is getting 80 years old now. This story, and it's the same over again. So it's a loop we see here, and we need to break that up. So as long as we don't do that, we can do as much emotional work as we can. But if we don't break up the structures, we will fail.
Thank you, Christoph. Iris.
No, just wanted to share you a story that happened recently in Albania. A 15-year-old girl, she was actually sexually assaulted from the person that it was supposed, and it was paid from the Ministry of Education to guard the school. And this rape was happening for 2 years, and then two other guys, after he started to blackmail the girl with a video that he has recorded, abused with the girl as well. So this story brought such a big frustration among in the society. But also, the weird thing that I have seen, it was the vox pops that the media were doing with the people in that particular place when the violence happened. And you could see not only old man that was having the perspective like she deserved it, why she was wearing like a short skirt or something like that, but you could see also young women that have the same attitude, and women that are also involved in that, which makes the thing very unsatisfactory. And we called a protest of the citizen, and we were like helpless actually, and we were like thinking like it will come the same group of the NGOs in the square where we called the protest. 50,000 citizens came into this protest. So I think there is always hope, and it should be done a lot of education and prevention.
Well, thank you, Iris. Yeah, please, Michael. And your 60 seconds.
I was going to say,
yeah.
Sure. Well, one of the key challenges here is to speak to the sense of pain or disadvantage or suffering that some of these young men have, but to do so in ways that are healthy for them and that do not increase the violence, the risks to others. That is, to do so in ways that are accountable, healthy, and aware of broader gender inequalities.
Thank you, Michael. Tuija, please.
Yes, so I'd like to go back a few steps and talk about, get back to Steve Bannon and the other angry old white man who is doing his work in the internet, in Twitter, and really mobilizing also angry white men, young men, to kind of support his politics. And I just want to say that we have to see the kind of connections, that there are these harmful ideologies that are entangled, racism, misogyny, anti-feminism, and whatnot. And we need to see the kind of a mechanic that he's using, that Trump is using, polarizing people and mobilizing these kind of men in weaker positions to get his goal and for his own benefit. And we need to stop that. We need to be aware that these young men are used when things like this happen. So yeah, we need to try to stop this horrible thing going on.
Well, thank you, Tuija. Thank you all. I'm so sorry for interrupting our discussion. Under normal circumstances, we could go and have a glass of wine or beer or something and continue discussion. Under these circumstances, we are much more limited. But I can make one promise. If you happen to come to Brussels, give me a call, and we can have a glass of wine or beer or water or whatever you prefer. But thank you so much, Christian, for your presentation, all panelists for your thoughts. Today in the morning I was on Estonian national radio, and there was huge interest towards this panel, and the organizers promised that there will be some concluding remarks will be one day on the website of the Ministry of Social Affairs. So stay tuned, and I'm sure we will run into each other in the near future. Thank you so much.